Okay, hi everyone. Thanks very much for joining us today for the discussion. My name is Dale Lilke. I'm a postdoctoral researcher here, and it's my pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague from Australia, Brendan Keogh. Not least because we don't really get the chance to have many Australian game studies academics here, although I am gradually trying to change that. But Brendan is a research fellow based at the Digital Media Research Centre at Queensland University of Technology. In 2017, he was awarded the prestigious Discovery Early Career Researcher Award by the Australian Research Council, which funds his current 3-year research project on skill development and transfer in the gaming sector. Before this, he completed his PhD at the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, which was also published last year as a book by MIT Press called A Play of Bodies, How We Perceive Video Games. The book sort of draws on theories of phenomenology and posthumanism to explore how our bodies and senses are shaped by and also shape the experience of playing video games. I believe there's a copy somewhere around here, and definitely try to read the book if you can. But Brendan is actually one of the most sort of prolific writers that I know in academia. He's published over a dozen journal articles and book chapters, but also countless articles in the mainstream press. He has an active blog and social media presence, and he also published a book, Killing is Harmless, which is one of the first sort of published book-length close readings of a video game that I know, Spec Ops: The Line. And he's also been at the forefront of debates around things like the emerging queer game scene, Gamergate, and the changing nature of game criticism. So Brendan is currently in Europe to conduct interviews and fieldwork in the Netherlands and elsewhere for his research, and kindly agreed to visit us here in Tampere for a couple of days. So we can expect to hear about sort of preliminary findings of this fieldwork in Australia, drawing on his extensive interviews with game makers in Australia, and also a nationwide survey, and his thoughts on the changing nature of the game development scene in Australia. So join me in welcoming Brendan.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Dale, for that flattering and embarrassing introduction. And thank you to everyone at the Centre for making me feel really welcome, inviting me here, flying me up here from Utrecht, and looking after me for the last day. It's been really great to visit and to see all the cool stuff happening here. I think Dale just said what I'm going to talk about, so I won't repeat that. I'll just jump right into it. If you have any feedback or questions or anything you want to give me that we don't have time for in question time, that's my email and Twitter if you want to reach out to me. I don't recommend following me on Twitter for my active social media presence. It's pretty trashy. There's a lot of words on my slides, a lot of like just kind of interview quotes and stuff. A lot of them are there mostly for me to remember what to say. I guess for the live stream people, but also if I'm going too fast for you, I just put a PDF on Google Slides. So please feel free to use that. You have 5 seconds until I change this slide to get that URL. Okay. Cool. So I want to start with like an anecdote of a particular game studio group, something in Australia, and I think their story is really interesting to kind of exemplify exactly what I'm really interested in with my project. So House is a group of 4 guys in Melbourne. They've been friends since high school. And they were playing a lot of indie games together on the couch, a lot of sports friends, a lot of Hokra, and they're like, hey, we can make a game together. And they got together, figured out what skills they had, and just decided to make a video game. They weren't game developers. One of them knew some HTML kind of coding. The others were like film students and art students. And they just they started working on this game called Push Me Pull You in a weird handmade kind of HTML engine. That caused nightmares when they had to put it in Unity and try to actually sell it later on. But at first they were just making the game for themselves, and one thing led to another. They got really involved in the local scene in Melbourne. The game got a lot of attention online. It showed at parties and at conferences like GDC. And several years later, they're releasing this game on PlayStation 4 and Steam. as a kind of one of the only kind of console releases out of the Australian industry that year, despite just starting this game as a few mates just doing it for fun. And now they're working on Untitled Game, which you might have seen on the internet. The videos have gone quite viral. They have a publisher, the same publisher who published Firewatch several years ago. It's going to be on Nintendo, on the Switch. The game was at PAX Expo Australia last year, but the House developers didn't need to go because it was just in the Nintendo booth next to Mario and Pokemon. And it's just kind of like, I think you could almost say it's probably one of the most anticipated games of 2019 in kind of gamer circles. And it's, they pay themselves a salary now to do this. It's like, it's a job for them. But previously they were just 4 friends making games. And somehow at some point they became professional game developers. But where exactly in that story they become professional game developers is kind of difficult to say and complicated. So I'm really interested in House and the million other houses in Australia and elsewhere in the world that I don't think really fit into traditional definitions of how we have often spoken about the video game industry, or even how the video game industry speaks about itself. So you'll see industry surveys in Australia, which kind of you self-nominate to fill out, and you'll see kind of statistics like this many people are employed in the game industry, they earn this much money, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, but how do you account for something like House, who probably early in their story, I imagine, I can't say for certain, probably weren't filling out those surveys or didn't even have a salary. They were just kind of making this game around their studies and part-time work. So I guess I'm really interested in what else is happening. This is a Venn diagram, it's not just a circle. But I guess I'm really happening what other game-making activity is happening outside of just what we would usually call the video game industry. So I guess a driving question for me is who else makes video games? And the else, I guess, is in brackets because I think generally I'm just interested in who makes video games, but the else, I guess, is implying or inferring there is a default understood group of people making video games or type of video game production. And I'm really interested in, well, who else apart from that is also making video games? So I don't really have to do the over spiel about the project because Dale's kind of already done that. It's a 3-year project. It's called Formal, Informal, Embedded, Australian Game Developers and Skill Transfer. And yeah, so I've been doing a bunch of interviews with Australian Gamemakers. I did too many and I had to transcribe all of them. And I'm doing some international field work with, I guess, other scenes and communities and industries that I think are interesting to compare to Australia. And in this particular talk, what I want to do is, I guess, give a kind of preliminary oversight of some of the things that have been told to me in these interviews and how I'm thinking about talking about, I guess, that broader range of question marks as maybe a video game field as opposed to a video game industry in a very, I suppose, straightforward, just slapping some Bordeaux onto it kind of way. I don't think I'm doing anything really revolutionary there, but I'm just trying to think through different ways to talk about a broader spectrum of game-making activities in a way that doesn't privilege or center one particular kind of game-making, like not overemphasizing commercial activity, but also not maybe over-romanticizing, creative unpaid work either. Just understanding all of it as maybe important and interacting and stuff. So yeah, for this talk, I'm going to give an overview of what I mean by formal, informal, embedded, and then probably ramble some questions at the end about what does this mean to think of it as a field, and how this kind of like connects to, I suppose, emerging discussions. Well, they're not really emerging anymore. They've pretty much emerged about localizing video game production studies and thinking about video game production in its local context. And I just have a lot of random photos of Australian video games. This is work in progress. It's pretty early. I haven't fully coded all my interviews and stuff yet. So these are some really preliminary observations and thoughts about it. Please feel free to ask me questions or push back or critique any of it. It's much appreciated, but it's quite preliminary. And I'm using the term game making instead of game development, which several people are doing. I don't have a whole big strategy for why I'm doing this or anything, but saying game development just sometimes feels weird when you're talking about certain kinds of game making activity, and it feels kind of very software industry-ish. So I just use the term game making. That's just a note on that. Cool, so I guess just an overview of game making in Australia. I'm not going to give like a whole history. Other people like John Banks, Melanie Swalwell, Jason Wilson and others have kind of done that. But I guess this part of the history is probably important for understanding why games are made in Australia the way they are now. So prior, I won't say prior, that's a spoiler. So back in the 90s and early 2000s, a lot of the Australian game industry was work for hire for usually American publishers. So an American publisher would have like the Shrek IP, and they're like, hey, we want to make a Shrek racing game. Who wants to make our Shrek racing game? And various studios in Australia would like bid for it. We could do it for this much money. We could do it for this much. And then one of them would get the job. So a lot of kind of these franchise games, a lot of work, kind of like outsourced work from American studios. A lot of the BioShock games were made in Australia, despite the kind of creative direction being led from America. And essentially, this was because of the exchange rate. It was really cheap for American publishers to pay some Australians to make these games. It's just offshore cheap labor in a country that speaks English and has a high literacy of technology. So there's a lot of that stuff happening in Australia. A lot of pretty unremarkable games, like they're fine, they probably made money, they're not like, they don't feel overly culturally significant in, they're not going to be in an art gallery anytime soon. But there was also a really interesting art game scene in Australia around this time. Escape from Woomera, about Australia's really poor treatment of refugees, which is still ongoing, was in the early 2000s, one of the first kind of serious games, and some other really interesting art stuff that was happening. So there's like this underbelly of cool, weird, arty stuff happening, and this kind of dominant industry of this stuff. And this all changed around the global financial crisis in 2008, where essentially Australia did pretty good out of a global financial crisis. The Australian dollar and the American dollar hit parity, so one American dollar was one Australian dollar. Great for online shopping and buying video games off American websites. Steam was really cheap, which was great. But it meant Australia was no longer a cheap option for American publishers. So suddenly it just didn't make sense for American publishers to pay Australian studios to make their games for them. So the opportunities dried up incredibly quickly. There was mass studio closures, hearing stories from developers about like surviving 3 rounds of layoffs and then the entire studio collapsing, so they get laid off anyway, going and getting another job somewhere else in the city, and the exact same thing happening. It's quite traumatic period of instability. And I think it's important to note there's also like some mismanagement happening here. Like these dollars, when these dollars hit when they were equal, none of these studios were really prepared to deal with that. They were quite short-sighted. There was all sort of your classic labor crunch issues happening in a lot of these studios. And I just think it's important to note that you can't just blame the economy and let the bosses get off. There was some other stuff going on. But that's kind of the general narrative. And yeah, the industry shrunk from one national census to the other, from nearly 1,500 down to about 600. So like nearly this 2/3 shrinkage, really quite dramatic. And that means that now, after this, the only real way to like make games commercially in Australia was to make indie games. So Unity was emerging, and these other game making tools were getting more accessible. Platforms like the iPhone were becoming more popular, and so you didn't have the backing of a large American publisher, but you could make a small game for iPhone and just release it on iPhone. So we saw a lot of these kind of small indie studios and solo developers emerging in the late 2000s. And later on, when digital and when PlayStation and Xbox and Nintendo got more into indie games, we're seeing more Australian games on those platforms as well. So now it's about 1,000 people employed in the industry, and over 50% of them are working on original IP rather than just being outsourced labor for American publishers, which is interesting. So now we're in this weird position where everybody is indie. In my surveys, over 80% of respondents have said, they identify with the labels like indie or independent. Other research has shown similar thing. So for 30-person studios are indie, the solo developers just working the weekend around a part-time job are indie, the students are indie, the kind of free-to-play, really commercial-looking games are indie. Everybody's indie in Australia. And it's this kind of way of, like Kate Oakley talks about, involuntary entrepreneurism or forced entrepreneurism, where people in these kind of really precarious contingent labor situations, like creative workers, take on the kind of language of entrepreneurism to kind of I suppose, sugarcoat it and make it seem more romantic, I chose to be self-employed, not actually nobody is actually hiring anyone. So indie in Australia kind of becomes this romantic notion that, yeah, we're indie, like, fuck the man, whatever. But really, like, there's no other choice. Like, no one is actually going to hire you anyway, so you have to be indie. But then indie becomes this really useless term. There isn't AAA in indie in Australia. Like, there's this whole range of different ways of making games, and all of them are indie. So suddenly indie is just this really useless term that doesn't narrow down the types of game making any more than just game making by itself does. It doesn't have any nuance. Oh yeah, so I've got this massive quote here, which I was going to read, which I think highlights just that there is granularity here. This was a, I'll just read it. So this person in Melbourne was like, sorry, I'll go back to it. This person in Melbourne was just kind of discussing and thinking about different tensions and politics within the Melbourne scene and the Melbourne industry. And I just want to read it out and I'll talk about why I'm reading it out. So they said that before the industry and the scene decided to be friends, the art people were really happy hanging out, making cool shit, talking about cool shit, pushing really hard for gender diversity. We were all around Melbourne doing our thing and having a good time. And then the industry opened up to us, and then the scene has opened up to the industry. So the wants of that scene were to make good art, yada, yada, yada. When that stuff started to become commercially viable, we found people with money and people at studios coming in saying, oh shit, this is cool, this has an audience. We want to make this stuff, we're going to hire you, but not you, you and not you. And they break up the scene with their money and opportunities. I feel like that's when it becomes political, and that's when it becomes ugly, and that's when it becomes really difficult to enjoy it. When it wasn't surrounded by money and we were still all able to get by, it was a delight. And in some ways, it's like a really cliche, not cliche, but like, I suppose typical way of like this art commerce tension of like, you know, the scene of the industry. It's no different from like bands or, you know, writers or painters or something. What I find really interesting is like articulation that there is an industry and there is a scene. These aren't the same things, but they interact and they mediate each other's situation. And all these people in the indie that in the industry this person's referring to would absolutely call themselves indie developers, and so would most of the people in the scene, or they might have stopped using indie because the industry is using that term. And I think this really highlights that there are two very different types of game making here, or more than two, I guess, a spectrum of game making that isn't just captured by what is happening in the industry. Like this quote is explicitly talking about game making outside of the industry as this important, vibrant thing. So I've started using terms, sorry for the 3 pixels there. So I've started using the terms formal and informal, mostly from Ramon Lobato and Julian Thomas's book, The Informal Media Economy, as kind of a way to kind of more nuancedly break down or use as a spectrum, I guess, modalities of game making. So instead of, I didn't like terms like professional amateur or like hobbyist or indie mainstream, because none of these terms really, these dichotomies really talk about what's happening. But Lobato and Thomas talk about formal and informal in terms of media economies as like, or informality as accounting for this broader range of media distribution and how media circulates. So accounting for like music piracy as well as CD sales as like a way that music circulates, and that the two have like a strong interconnection. Like the music industry, the formal music industry radically shifted because of illegal, informal MP3 sharing, right? So now we have streaming and we have iTunes and we have iPods and whatnot. So it's a really interesting way to think about the intersection between these two without using kind of these existing dichotomies. And it's not so much that there are formal makers and informal makers, but more to think about the flows of informality and formality across those scenes. So who is informally making games on the weekend, and who is formally making games as part of like, you know, paying taxes and has like a registered company to make games. And sometimes people flow between those, like House, who are kind of informally making games on the weekend, and then we're a games company. And somewhere, you know, that happened. And then I added this other term because formal and informal was kind of missing these people who are embedded game makers. And the term embedded I take from Stuart Cunningham, who is a colleague at QUT, to think about like creative workers or cultural workers who use their kind of cultural work skill sets in, I guess, like non-creative sectors. So if you're a film student and you go work for an advertising company, or you're a game development student, you learn how to use Unity and you go work for the military doing VR simulation or something like that. So because in Australia, there's a lot of people making games, a lot of people using game development skills, you know, as a job, but they're doing client work for like making advertising games or education software or they're just doing web development, which have maybe little browser games in them. And so they're kind of not in what we would traditionally call the games industry, but they're still using game development skills within the Australian economy, and are still interacting with other Australian game makers. So I guess that's my other part. I'm going for time. Cool. Cool. Something like, how do you think about these three things beyond just a video game industry? I don't want to be super semantic about it. Like, some people would just say that all of this is a cultural industry. But I'm thinking of, like, just in a Bordeaux sense, it's kind of a field, right? Like, these groups aren't necessarily stable. They're kind of more trajectories, and there's all kind of weird stuff happening. There's a lot of tension. There's a lot of politics. There's a lot of kind of, you know, territory marking, or like different stakes in terms of what Australian video game making is considered to be, especially when talking to government or talking to investors or whatnot. So you can kind of see, like, I guess, these struggles and these power relations between all of these as just a field of cultural production. And again, I'm not doing anything super fancy with Bordeaux here. It's just like, what if we just thought about it this way rather than just simply being an industry where people are trying to make money? And I think that maybe gets away from this homogenous idea of the industry, which I think often can just like really narrow down or reduce, I guess, the range of reasons people make games, the range of reasons people share games, or the type of communities, down to kind of like who is starting a company, who is trying to run a business, who is trying to do this stuff. Because, you know, I would speak to people who make games that are released on Steam around working in a supermarket, or you go to like a warehouse party that's probably going to be shut down by the cops in Melbourne, which is mostly being run by indie developers, and there's like bespoke indie games being projected onto walls off milk crates. And you're like, this in no way relates to my understanding of like how we talk about the video game industry. So it's like about thinking about different ways to think about this, I suppose. So I guess then I'm interested is, how do the formal, informal, embedded game making activities constitute what I'm calling, I suppose, the Australian field of video game production? Tentatively calling. I'm very happy to be critiqued and have pushback on that. This is still pretty early thinking. I'm going to drink something. Cool. So I guess for the rest of the talk, what I really want to do is dive into, I guess, each one of these three, like talk about, show some interview quotes and talk about, I guess, the formal area of this field, the formal bit. I don't know, the informal area, the embedded area, what different developers are kind of saying in these areas in terms of their own ambitions and their own identity as game makers. And yeah, just kind of like look at it. So there's going to be a lot of interview quotes. I'll probably just ramble about them for a bit. And at some point I'll run out of time, so I'll skip forward to the conclusion. But we'll see how that goes. So formal game making, I guess this is the part that I think you can most confidently call like the Australian video game industry, and the people who would most call themselves the Australian video game industry. But even then, they're still radically different from the, I guess, what we would traditionally call like the global video game industry when I think about like Ubisoft or Nintendo or From Software or whatever. The average size of a company in Australia is 9 people in the games industry. Like, that's the average. We've got, I think, one studio that's about 150, which is an EA mobile studio, because they bought 2 indie studios and mushed them together. And we have a wargaming studio in Sydney, which is about 100 people. But then the next big, like the big indies are about 30 to 40 people. And lots of small teams, lots of contract work, like quite precarious. Lots of interaction between the studios, as opposed to the kind of secretive nature of the game industry we're used to reading about in like Casey O'Donnell's Developer Dilemma, and, you know, all the NDAs and lots of secrecy. Australian developers are very open and just talking about their work and tweeting about their work. I'll rock up to do interviews and I just go, hey, do you want to see our unannounced game we're working on? Oh yeah, by the way, don't tweet it or something. And I shouldn't tweet anything. But yeah, lots of meetups, lots of co-working spaces. House run a co-working space called Share House, and it's them and 2 other studios. And they're just kind of like, we have extra room, you also want to make your game here. Lots of people sharing contacts, like someone needs a contact at Apple to try to get their game featured. They're just like, hey, who knows somebody at Apple I can talk to? And lots of what I guess I would call like horizontal mentorship, where there's not that many veterans. A lot of people left after the old industry kind of collapsed. So a lot of people are kind of talking to people in other studios to figure out, how do you even form a business? How do you pay your taxes? How do you do stuff? So yeah, very collaborative, but also very precarious, lots of fixed term employment, not many people who would like, I would ask, where do you expect to be in 5 years? And the most common answer was, like, no one knows, it's quite precarious. And there's this whole like Aussie battler identity tied up with the industry crash where everyone feels like, you know, we went through the war together, everything fell apart, we had government funding briefly and then we lost it again. Like, we're all doing it rough together, we're all like mates from the war, I guess. There's this real solidarity sense there. So some things that get interesting here because of this particular forming of the formal game industry in Australia. Because like the teams are so small, there's not really very clear job titles a lot of the time. I would start all my interviews with this what I thought was going to be a really straightforward, just what's your name, age, and job title, and I thought they would say that, and then I would ask my real questions, and I think I would just cause these existential crises by asking people what their job title was. They're like, I've never thought about that. So people are like, I guess I'm a designer, or like, I'm comfortable calling myself a designer, but I kind of do everything. People who are just like, oh, we don't have job titles, but I'm the one that knows how to program, so I guess I'm a programmer. And yeah, you can see. But this was very, very common. And then like I've spoken to a few Australians at like AAA companies in other countries, and they're just like, oh yeah, my job title's this. I'm like, okay, cool. Like very, very specific. And it kind of speaks to just how general and kind of diverse, I suppose, the labour is of the skills required are for like in small teams, just you're producing, you're designing, it really depends day by day. So yeah, even the idea of people having job titles, and if you want to break down how many designers or how many programmers or how many producers are in the Australian game industry, like that's next to impossible to do that. And so yeah, so then there's that sense that everyone's in the war together, that everyone is helping each other out. And so so you can see in this top quote, the global financial crisis is this kind of part of the narrative of why the Australian industry is how it is, even a decade later. So like after the decimation of the industry, that happened after the GFC, there's definitely not that secretive culture anymore. If you tried to do that here, you'd be laughed at. There's an attitude of collaboration, helping people out. But I think you only get out of adversity and everybody panicking about survival, which is really interesting. And then a sense about how the competitive nature of the local industry's changed, where back in the day, whoever owned that Shrek IP would be coming to Australia with a bag of money and be like, all right, who wants to make this game? Pitch us your ideas and how cheap you can make it. So like if this company got the job, this company would not get the job. Like it was like, pretty competitive. Whereas these days, as this bottom person says, there's no concept of stealing users from one another. We all want to steal users from Supercell or Valve, but there's no sense of personal stuff. Before the global financial crisis, there it is again, a publisher would have one deal to hand out. Just as I said, it's a very different competitive environment. So I'd commonly hear like, rising tide helps all of us. If some game does good here, that's great for all of us. Like this real sense of, I suppose, like, I don't know, kind of like creative cluster kind of sense that it's good for all of us to be working in this way. And we have collaborative game spaces, like every capital city in Australia now I think has like a games co-working space nearly. Some are much different scale. And I think things like the Dutch Game Garden were quite influential there. But we have the Arcade in Melbourne. Adelaide has Games Plus, and yeah, there's quite a few different ones around. So yeah, lots of collaboration. But then it's interesting, like from the outside, it's like, oh cool, there's all these small indie studios. There's about 1,000 people employed in the industry now. We're producing these world-class games that are winning awards and BAFTAs and GDC awards, like Florence. But like really, like you actually speak to people and they're like, I've just been living off savings for the last 2 years, or my partner has a really stable job, would be a really common one you'd hear. Or I'm living on Centrelink, which is like Australian kind of like unemployment, social welfare, which is getting harder and harder to get. So when you actually speak to people, the actual financial situation is often a lot more dire and precarious than, when you just look at, this game's got 10,000 followers on Twitter and looks really professional. And something I would hear a lot, like people would be very happy for themselves to take pay cuts or to not pay themselves to like make their dream game. But they would be very, very stubborn about making sure everyone else that's working on their game gets paid. So like they would always have contractors get paid, or they would do a revenue share kind of model, but then be very generous about it. So like there's a lot of kind of like people articulate this kind of good like labor politics and wanting to unionize and all this kind of thing. But when it comes down to their own practice, they're very happy to make these sacrifices in order to be able to make games, right? Which is interesting. Yeah, and this different kind of a way of thinking about it, where this team is just like, well, we're making money for now, but like we don't expect for that to happen forever. Like you can kind of feel in this one, like they're just a bit more chill about not being super stressed about whether or not this is financially sustainable. And it's like very different way. It's not like I have a business, my business needs to last forever. This one is just much more, I'm making games for my friends, I'm able to support myself doing that. That's pretty cool. I'm not sure if I will be able to in the future, but that's just being in any other creative field. And I think that final sentence, if you're doing any other creative field, the baseline is that you won't make money. You know, they feel like it's weird. This person feels like it's weird that games often consider them, game developers, think that the starting point is, you know, running a business successfully, not just making art with your friends and then maybe one day making money. Whereas if you're starting a band with your friends, you're not going to be like, right, I've registered my band as a company now to be financially stable. You're going to be like, well, let's just jam over the weekend and see what happens. So some very different ways of thinking about running a business. I should fast forward a bit. But yeah, just some interesting things. I guess the only point I'll make here before I go on quickly is that everyone, like as I said, it's like kind of this like real, in the way people talk, it's like real progressive politics, everyone wanting to be pro-diversity, pro-gender, everything like that, and it is more diverse than the old industry was, but still very male-dominated, and incredibly white as well, and Australia is quite diverse ethnically, but the game industry is not. But while everyone can talk the talk of like being really pro-diversity, pro-inclusion, like no one can actually afford to pay like maternity leave, no one can afford to pay menstrual leave, no one's like, everyone's hiring people in like fixed term contracts. I say no one, sorry, some people can, very few people can. If you're making just games with your 4 friends, then you're not actually planning on growing, you just want to make more games with your 4 friends. So that doesn't necessarily help more people, you know, of different identities get into the industry, even if you are personally pro more people getting into the industry. So it's complicated. But then as we've seen in the last year, like large AAA companies just lay people off all the time anyway. So is that actually any more sustainable? It's kind of a big question I don't have an answer to. So then like think about informal game making or what they're kind of saying. I guess essentially I think in Australia specifically, because the formal industry is so grassroots, so kind of messy and contingent, all this informal stuff, all the amateurs and stuff is just more visible than say, if you're in like Seattle or Montreal where there's like 10,000 formally employed game developers, you know, just hobbyists are a little bit overshadowed and I think a little bit harder to just see. Whereas in Australia, there's so much, in Australian cities, I think there's a lot of overlap and a lot of intermingling, and maybe perhaps the same here as well, I couldn't say. But I think so it's really interesting how visibly intermingling they are. So one of the questions I was asking all my participants was, do you consider yourself part of the video game industry? And, you know, quite a few people were essentially saying, no, I don't. Some were saying, yes, I'm a professional game developer, but many would say they're not in the industry. Or like this one, I consider myself part of a community, but not the industry, you know, because they don't have consistent employment. And these people kind of like turning into, I think maybe a creative autonomy kind of way of thinking about it. Like, I don't expect to make any real money off this game. What we want to do is just continue to make stuff together. Like, you hear that a lot. I just want to make enough money to make the next game. And that's something, Jennifer Whitson and others have kind of heard from like Canadian indies as well. What was I saying? Yeah, and this final one, this idea that they came through it as like an artist or like, you know, for them it's creative practice, it's not professional practice. Like obviously those are complicated to split up, but for them they're like, you know, they have a job, this is just their art, right? You know, they like to make money, but it's not what they're doing it for. But so this is an interesting quote. This is from someone employed in a game industry studio. So the informal game makers I speak to are overwhelmingly probably in their 20s, and essentially can afford to just make art 2 or 3 days a week because they don't have a mortgage, they don't have kids, they may be still students. So this developer was like, it's really interesting to find that kind of pressure between creative and commercial. I think it's the biggest sticking point of games, and I get very excited that you can combine the two. It's not always the case. Some people say I'm interested in it purely for a creative side, and bless you, that's wonderful. I'm glad you don't have a mortgage, good for you. Like if you can just make games for the fuck of it, what a position of privilege are you in? If you don't have to commercialize it, then all power to you. But you know, if you want to keep talent, that's got skills, then you need to commercialize it. The older we get, the more we cost to run, and we have families we need to support. So kind of pushing back, like, so there's people in the industry that quote I showed earlier is probably like complaining about or being critical of as like kind of destroying the scene because, you know, with their commercialization and their neoliberal mindset or whatever. This kind of mindset kind of counters that one where it's like, look, you're in your 20s, you can afford to just like make widget and put it on itch.io, but I have kids in school, I'm getting old, I need to like retire one day, I need some superannuation. And so there's this interesting tension of creative autonomy and commercial feasibility there, which very much is centered around age, but also other privileges around like gender and division of labor and whatnot, and whether you live in a capital city or whether you live out bush and stuff like that. And I guess the last thing I want to say about informal stuff before I wrap up on the embedded stuff, this was a representative at Film Victoria, and Film Victoria does really good games funding for Victorian game developers, fund some really interesting art games and stuff. And I asked this person, why would you fund, I used Ian McLarty as an example, why would you fund a solo developer, you know, who's not going to hire anyone, right? Like they're not planning on, they only want to make games by themselves. Why would you give them money if it's not going to create jobs, which I assume is the only thing governments care about? And he says, in Melbourne, we have a higher concentration of companies of some kind of profile, regardless of their commercial success. If we didn't have that, we wouldn't have a growing industry, we'd have a couple of communities. Part of our interest is in ensuring that success is purely on the basis of commercial output and understanding that as a creative industry, sometimes creative works need to be done that don't necessarily have strong financial output now, but will later have positive benefits. So Ian McLarty's work for positioning about on the Apple Store helps to draw attention to this sector here in Victoria, helps us to draw attention to Australia, and that helps to gradually create and grow a larger, stronger industry. So they're in particular drawing attention to, I guess, the cultural capital or the social capital of Australia, of, I guess, this broader field of informal game makers who can afford to make weird experimental stuff that might not sell well, but seeing that it's having this really positive impact on how Melbourne games are perceived nationally and internationally, and maybe that will attract other people to work in studios here and they will hire people. So there's really interesting articulation of like the value of how cultural capital is kind of translated into economic capital, I suppose, and how that builds an industry, and kind of like directly saying this broader range of informal stuff is important for the growth of the industry. I just found that a really interesting articulation and like a really clear articulation. So then embedded game makers quickly, and this like embedded game makers is probably the area of like probably spend the least amount of time theorizing, and I need to spend a lot of work on it. Whenever I write about it, it's like always like the final footnote, and now I'm running out of time, so I'm going to rush it as well. But essentially you have all these people who maybe get game development degrees, couldn't find anywhere to get a job, but they're like, well, I need to start a business, because there's that mindset that, you know, to start a game development studio, you start it as a business. You don't just make games with your friends, as other people think. So they're like, well, the only way to do that viably here isn't to take a massive risk and spend all my savings to start my own IP, but to like get work making advertising games, or to get work doing education games or VR simulation. So like Chaos Theory Games is a studio in Sydney of graduates, and they did a range of degrees. And yeah, they just make games like Snakes for Game. We have these lollies or candy in Australia, which are snakes. So I guess they made a snake clone, which I guess is maybe a Finnish game. Anyway, we cloned your game. Yeah, anyway, there's really, so the way these people talk about their development process is often, we can get more money doing this, but not in this like, we want to get rich quick or anything, but just more like, we actually want to pay our staff, or I'm not going to spend my savings to make a game, that's ridiculous. So I am going to go work for the military, or I am going to go work for this insurance company. So there's this really interesting, like, we won't do this unless it's financially sustainable to do it. And this sense, this articulation at the end here, like, everyone in this studio wants to be working on games for a consumer audience, but we don't have a war chest right now. This idea that, like, one day we'll hopefully make our own games, but for now, this is all we have to do this because we don't have the money to do it. But it's interesting to see other studios actually doing that, don't have the money to do it most of the time as well. They're more making sacrifices to do it. This person says the same thing. And yeah, so there's some really interesting politics here where people are like maybe working for the defense sector and feeling really kind of complicated about doing that. They don't like working for the military, perhaps. But they want to pay their staff. So for politics of like, you know, creative labor and actually paying people versus the politics of what kind of work you're doing are kind of clashing for these people in really interesting ways. And yeah, as I said, that's all I'm going to say about the embedded stuff. It's really interesting. I don't have much more to say about it, but I'm happy to chat about it in question time. So to wrap up then, so I guess to think about an Australian video game field would be to think about a range of people making video games under different contexts, with different resources, for different reasons. Like, there isn't one reason people make games. They're not trying to achieve one thing with their games, but they're using their game development skills, not even to make games sometimes, in a wide range of ways. And yeah, they're not all captured by thinking about the video game industry, but they all contribute to the size of and shape of what video game production in Australia looks like having a really profound impact on each other. They're not distinct. And yeah, so maybe that's a field. I don't know. And so this connects. So there's a lot of researchers, including people in this room, and people. I think Daniel Joseph in 2013 was maybe one of the earliest ones with his article in the Toronto game scene. And Africa talks about a lot in global games. This need to understand local video game production or local video game industries, plural, as opposed to just what does game development look like. Because if you just ask what does game development look like, often it's very easy to end up talking about just AAA companies and indie companies with this very kind of North American focused model, or maybe a Japanese focused model. And in most countries in the world, and not even countries, even in most regions, like even in parts of North America or parts of Japan perhaps, it doesn't make sense to think about game development practice happening in that way. And like we've seen that, especially like Yaroslav's book about, Czech game development in the 80s, and how I think the subtitle of that book is like how amateurs created an industry or whatever. It's not exactly that. But, pointing out and essentially like people were making video games before there was a video game industry, right? So there's always this broader, messier stuff that needs to be accounted for. And I think especially if we want to account for video game production in maybe non-Western countries or whatnot, maybe thinking about accounting for that broader range of types of activity without prescribing it has to look a certain way is maybe more useful to think about. Maybe, I don't know. Yeah, cool. Yeah, stuff I haven't talked about here, which I kind of need to dive into. The role of like game development education. Australia has way more students doing game development every year than we have jobs in the industry, which is partly why everyone has to be entrepreneurial and be indie, and why people go into this embedded kind of sector, because we have a lot of people with game development skills and they don't necessarily have jobs from in the industry. So that's a massive area I need to talk about. Translocal and local scenes, so like the Melbourne scene, the Adelaide scene, the Brisbane scene, like you could zoom in much closer than I have in this talk, and like the intersections between those different scenes, and internationally as well. Government funding, I haven't really talked about. I haven't talked about rural video game makers. Australia is very big. There's a lot of people living very remotely who can also make games because they have a laptop and maybe an internet connection. And it's something I'm really interested in exploring further, which I haven't quite figured out yet, is how to talk about the broader non-commercial work, like the informal work, without, on one hand, glorifying unpaid labor, which is a massive problem in the game industry, and glorifying passion, and you take a pay cut in order to do what you love, which is hugely problematic, but also not wanting to demonize it when people can articulate to me, I don't want this to be a job, I don't want to work in a video game industry because of those exact labor issues, but I want to make art. So I'm still figuring out how do you negotiate that without perpetuating bad issues and without taking away the agency of your participants. These are the things I said. Yeah, lots of people make video games, some people make money. That's literally the same as every other creative field. Yeah, cool. Thanks.
Cool, thanks very much for that comprehensive talk. It was really fascinating. I think we have maybe a bit under 15 minutes for questions, so does anybody have any thoughts or questions for Brendan about his presentation or about his work? Heikki.
So what kind of publications are you planning to do out of this?
Yeah, cool. So the grant is an interesting one. So it's not like you promise to produce one piece of research in order to show all of it. So it's more like producing a body of work, I suppose. So when I applied for the grant, I said I would produce 2 journal articles a year and a monograph at the end of it. And so I had a journal article come out late last year where I talk about the formal, informal kind of conflicting stuff in Creative Industries Journal. And yeah, so I'm working on, this is kind of an article in progress at the moment. This presentation, like a broad overview of Australia. I'm really struggling to fit it all in because my quotes are too long. And I want to do another article on like education, game development education. And there'll hopefully be a book eventually about it as well. I don't know exactly what shape that'll be yet. But yeah, academic journal publications and a book. And from my survey data, I'd really like to produce a report later this year as well that maybe is more publicly available and the industry will hopefully find useful to be like, you know, about demographic data and what people have said to me and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, lots.
The back one.
What other countries are you comparing this to right now, and what main differences are you finding or something?
Yeah, that's a great question. So on this trip, I've spent the last 2 weeks in the Netherlands because, so essentially I'm really interested in countries that have large, emerging or large, I suppose, like grassroots industries, like this kind of homegrown, you know, like companies, like a Dutch company starting in the Netherlands, and as opposed to kind of being helicoptered in from Ubisoft or whatever. So I'm really interested to look at countries that also have emerging kind of homegrown industries and think about what are the differences and similarities there. So I've been doing some interviews with Dutch game developers, mostly around Utrecht, because I know people there in the Dutch Game Garden, and I'm friends with some developers who can put me in touch with other developers. I'm going to do some interviews next week in Berlin because I'll be there for a maze, and so Berlin seems to have an interesting indie thing. And it's radically different from Australia, but I was doing some interviews in Montreal last year because I was there for a conference and I know some indies in Montreal. So Montreal alone has like 10,000 game developers, which is like 10 times all of Australia. Like it's unreal. Like 3,000 people at Ubisoft alone. And so I guess that's the easy one. The main difference between Canadian indies I've spoken to and Australian Gamemakers I've spoken to has been the way they talk about their own practice feels much more influenced by the industry. Like I'd speak to an indie developer in Montreal and they're like, oh, we have an unannounced project, but they wouldn't say what it was or even what kind of game. Like they'd be much more close to their chest about it, which I imagine is because that's just how the industry works. Like it's how you're used to behaving. Whereas Australians, like, it's already in front of you on a phone before you even ask to see it. And that also means there's a lot of people in the indie studios in Montreal who like have like years of experience in AAA or in these large studios and have now started their small studio with that experience of how to actually run a large team and how to be a human. Whereas there's a lot of I keep saying indie, sorry, there's a lot of small studios in Australia, which are just, all of them have just graduated. They haven't really learnt, you know, how to be a good employer, how to be good with HR and stuff. So you see a lot of small studios in Australia making the same mistakes over and over again because they don't have senior staff or they don't have experience working under someone else to like know how to act. I've only just done my Netherlands research, so I think the main difference with Netherlands and Australia is probably like proximity to, I suppose, the rest of Europe. So a Dutch indie developer can very easily just go to a maze in Berlin, like, or whatnot, whereas Australia, to get to Europe is like 30 hours, or to get to America is like 15 hours. And most of us only speak English, so stuff happening in Asia is less useful for most Australian developers. Not all, but most. So that difference is really interesting. And I suppose the other main thing, I feel like it's hard to say because I've only spent several weeks in these other countries, so it's possible I've just missed it. But it still feels like in Australia, the collaboration and the visibility of like people who just make games on the weekend in conversation with the people formally employed to make games still feels like uniquely visible in the Australian community, where even when I went and hung out with some Dutch game developers and had drinks, everyone there, they either worked in the industry or they didn't, or like they used to, but they stopped doing it. So seeing just people who make Twine games or Bitsy games, like I haven't really seen them hanging out with probably formal developers in other countries in the same way they just seem to intermingle in Australia. And I can't say that too confidently, but that seems to be a difference from my very preliminary looking. Sorry, that was a really rambly answer. But,
There was a question in the middle.
Yeah. So you said that there are like the amount of people studying game making or game development is increasing, and the places like for jobs are not in like that
Yep.
on the same scale. So have you been able to interview any like students or people who are like gaining the skills, and if like are they seeking or pursuing employment in the bigger companies that possibly can pay for the salary, like consistent salaries and leaves and stuff, or is there some kind of like a reluctance or rebellion like towards the industry?
Yeah, man, education's a really complex one. I think essentially when they're still students, yes, I have spoken to a lot of students and I've been speaking to educators as well. I need to be careful not to generalize. I'm not used to presenting like ethnographic data. Many of the students I've interviewed, while they're still students, and I've taught game development in Australia as well, often just have no idea what the local game industry looks like. Often they come in, they want to like be a creative director in AAA. They love playing Dark Souls, they love playing Skyrim, and they want to make Dark Souls and Skyrim, and they just simply don't understand that's not going to happen. Even if we had a AAA industry, that's like you're going to work in QA, then it's going to be like 20 years before you're Todd Howard or whatever. So you need to do a lot of like reconfiguring their own like dreams almost. Like you don't want to like squash their dreams, but you need to be like help nudge them into actually having believable dreams, which is starting your own indie company, or if you're very, very lucky, working for one of these 50-person studios, or using these skills outside of the games industry, like helping them actually understand the transferability of using Unity, of using Unreal, of being able to do the problem solving. But that really comes down to individual teachers. Like it's not usually baked into the unit development, the curriculum. If you're lucky enough to have a teacher to tell you that at a point where you're actually listening to your teachers, then you might be okay. And so I think a lot of them would love to not be indie. Like, I think a lot of them like internalize this idea of like, yeah, it's cool being indie, so I'm going to do that. And like kind of like try to push to the back of their mind, that's literally my only option if I want to do this. And you see some of the programs in Australia definitely moving more towards how to run your own business, or how to make a game with a team of 4 people. Much more generalist skill sets as opposed to like how to do this wide range of things in Unity, how to code a bit, how to design a bit, how to produce, how to project manage, instead of just here is how you be a gameplay designer or a level designer, because it's just those jobs for that. Essentially most of the students just end up not working in the game industry, whether they want to or not, but I don't have like quantity data about where. I haven't followed alumni yet, but yeah, it's very complicated. Yeah.
Tom had a question at the back.
Brendan, thanks for your talk.
Thanks, Tom.
You kind of asked people to comment on this, and that's the only reason why I'm bringing this up.
Yeah.
But it's about the Australia thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm noticing in your talk, sometimes you're saying game development in Australia, and sometimes you're saying Australian game development. And, just because of my relationship to Australia, I'm kind of thinking about what those kind of differences mean.
Yeah, totally.
And then, of course, you're citing Made in Woomera. Escape from Woomera, right?
Yeah. Led by a New Zealander.
Yeah, well, exactly, right.
Yeah.
So it's like one of those questions which I think is really interesting about the constitution of the Australian field is whether the kind of transnationality in the movement which characterised the Australian kind of scene is being able to be captured, or whether, it's a tricky one.
Yeah, totally. It's definitely a complicated one. Actually, and this came up when a few of us got a tour of a museum yesterday about what counts as a finished game and what's not a finished game.
When it's finished.
So, yeah, when it's finished, yeah. Games are never finished, they're just abandoned. I haven't made a single finished joke yet. Thanks, John. I was doing so good. Yeah, I mean, it's complicated, and I think that's a good point about those terms specifically, because Australian game development could imply game development done by Australians, by Australian citizens, which obviously restricts it, as opposed to game development in Australia maybe implies a broader term. And Escape from Woomera is so interesting since, Catherine is from New Zealand, but it's a very it's about Australia. Like you can see Australia in the game, like the desert and whatnot.
It was funded by the Australian government, excellent.
Yeah, exactly. Like I had Arts Council funding by the Australian government. That's a good point too. So it's really complicated. I think my main approach, and I don't know if this might not be the ideal approach. It's going to sound bad, like to not think too hard about it, or like, which is I think very easy to say as like a white male Australian citizen, but rather to like not police those borders too much, like allow there to be wriggle room and allow there to be ambiguity. Like I'll know it when I see it, I guess. Like and that has a risk of like not actively ensuring it doesn't become homogenized or hegemonic. I don't know, and I think it's accounting for the flows between the different scales, whether it's between cities or between countries or between different online communities. I think that's just really important to keep hold of and to ensure you don't resolve it, to keep it messy and complex and not try to make it too neat, I guess. But I don't have a really clear answer, but I think it's a really important point. I'll take that on board.
Ollie?
Since I know that Print is actually taking only the 2 o'clock train, I think we can go over time like a few minutes.
I'm happy to.
Since I have both a comment and maybe a question. The comment is about it's really interesting the issue of competition and how they're kind of feeling that they're not kind of stealing users from each other and that kind of stuff, because that's like very similar to what people say about the Finnish industry. That, I mean, and there's this kind of openness that people are kind of sharing information between studios. And stuff. And I'm just like kind of thinking about like how much this is a kind of something common to actually to maybe like many places that are kind of placed outside the immediate kind of centers of the global industry.
I suspect absolutely. Like I would imagine, as I'm still quite preliminary in my own international fieldwork, but like I don't think Australia is probably necessarily remarkable in that sense. I think what's probably remarkable about Australia is just, for me, it's a very convenient case study, both because I live there and also because it's got this interesting history where it did have larger studios that then disappeared before it's now forced into the same kind of situation as most countries trying to build a game industry. I think it's a really just an interesting case study of what game development looks like effectively anywhere that doesn't have these really large American studios or Japanese studios, or other countries as well, but mostly American or Japanese studios setting up there, like just a grassroots homegrown industry. And there's definitely like national particularities with types of government funding, types of social welfare and whatnot, obviously. But absolutely, I think that that kind of collaborative thing, I think, is probably much more common. And I think I said to you at Digra, maybe I remember scribbling it down during one of your talks at the pre-conference workshop. Like maybe like we're used to thinking about like AAA of a mainstream industry as the center, and AAA indie broadly defined as the periphery. And I think maybe if you look beyond America and Japan specifically, you see that indie is almost normal. Indie is kind of more of the normal historical central way that games have been made historically, and AAA is actually kind of a blip that just happened to have for 10 or 20 years, and it's really dominated how we think about games and that, but is actually quite a fringe way of making games. It's just, if that makes sense. So, so I think there's interesting ways to like flip how we think about what is the normal, that's a very loaded term, but the kind of the standard way of making video games.
Exactly. Like, it makes a lot of sense. And it's also at the same time this kind of story about this kind of we're not competing with each other. It's a kind of compelling kind of story to tell.
Totally.
It's this kind of nice idea, and it's like at the same time, for example, in Finland, it's clear that of course the studios are kind of competing from like experienced employees and so on.
Totally. And it's the same in Australia to some extent, where like they tell this story of how cheery and together and everyone is and how happy we all are together. But there's absolutely like politics and scene drama. Like there's scene drama now because there's so much informal, messy stuff, and it gets really complicated. And there are like there's like Women in Games Whisper networks, which are really important, who still say you shouldn't work for this person, but this person's fine. Like, there's also all the same sort of problems and critical issues and issues that do exist elsewhere in the game industry. And I think it's important not to like candy color it too much but it is interesting how the Australian game makers themselves often present this kind of united front, I suppose, of the Australian game industry in this really it's useful to do that. And there are a lot of friends, there is a lot of collaboration. It seems like actually really great, but there is an underbelly like everywhere. So it's important to think about how that works, I suppose. Yeah.
I do have the question as well, but I mean, we can leave it later.
I'm happy to go for another 5 minutes, so I don't mind if people want to chat.
Sure.
People should also feel free to walk out if you want to leave. Go for it, Ollie.
Okay, maybe I'll just then continue very quickly, because I mean, I just can't think about when we said about this. I was like okay, in Australia, like everyone's indie, and that is like the kind of the overview of the industry right now. But then I'm thinking about like kind of at the same time we have this kind of larger trends like for example the sudden centrality of game analytics and metrics and that kind of stuff. And Jen Whitson was visiting us last year, and she actually talked a bit about from the kind of Canadian or maybe like from the Montreal perspective about this kind of how even small studios are kind of forced to adopt this discourse and then kind of talk about or kind of acquire these processes of, let's say, user acquisition without really kind of having a very good idea how this works out. And have you kind of observed anything related to this?
Yeah, a little bit. Like I find Jen's work with Felon and Bart's really interesting. And we were talking about yesterday at the Reading Group, their article about the missing producer and how indies use that language of like tech startups and Silicon Valleys and entrepreneurism. When if you talk about them about their own goals, they just want to make enough money to make another game with their friends. So there's that really interesting clash there. And I think in Australia, I guess you see that most clearly, probably in how the embedded kind of studios, the studios doing client work and doing work for hire, versus the studios really trying to get their own IP off the ground. I think the way they talk about their practice and their, I suppose, like business structure and their own processes kind of like gets into that. I think like it's really interesting to see who is thinking about doing game development primarily as figuring out how to run a business sustainably and how to grow and how to have a certain, I don't know my business terms, like a certain amount of like GPI, whatever it's called, each year, as opposed to ones being like, I'm just making games with my friends and it's cool that PlayStation wants our game. So it's, I don't know, I don't have a specific answer, but like there's definitely very different ways that different kinds of groups and studios and individuals talk about their practices, either across our like art commerce kind of spectrum of ways of prioritizing your work. And I guess also there are a bunch of intermediary kind of companies popping up, like indie publishers and PR companies that specialize in, indie PR and stuff. So lots of those kind of intermediary companies popping up around the place, which is really interesting. Or like helping you write grant applications for Film Victoria. Lawyers who specialize in like video game copyright IP law who are available for people. So I guess that's probably in that intermediary kind of work area that's kind of popping up a bit. So I don't feel like that was a really direct answer, but that's kind of
Really interesting stuff.
Cool.
So do we have a final quick question for Brendan? Yeah.
It feels like a lot of the community-based stuff is based on in-person collaboration in the cities, and where most of the stuff is. And I know your slide said that you had done some research on rural game making.
Yep.
And does that primarily mean that the people in the rural areas travel to the cities, or is there examples of rural get-togethers?
Yeah, cool. For rural game developers is on my things I still need to do slide, mostly. But yeah, there's been, generally they're quite remote in terms of physical proximity. Like you're totally right, like actual local proximity and physical meetups and things like both formally and informally, like just meeting at a pub or doing game jams and personal relationships. All these things are super important in each city has its own kind of community, and they all talk to each other a lot on social media. And yeah, the few rural people I have spoken to are quite remote in terms of physical communities. Often they make up for this with like an online community, like they're still on Twitter with other people. But often they're like really just, yeah, they're very reliant on the online work, both for either getting contract work that they can do remotely, or yeah, they're just making their own games quite remotely. And it's really interesting too, like those local communities are really, really important for those scenes in those cities. But there's also examples in nearly each city of like a team that just makes games without any connection to the local scene. And they're very easy to miss those people. And I think that's something I'm interested in as well, is like how do you account for the people who aren't involved in the community? So for example, Hollow Knight is an Australian game made in Adelaide. And it's like a team of 2 or 3 people. And from what other people tell me, in Adelaide, they're like not super involved in the local community. They're not coming to meetups very often. They're not doing that kind of stuff. They just do their own thing, which is cool. They can do that. Where Golf Story on the Switch was made just outside of Brisbane, and that game came out on the Switch, was really popular. And then the Brisbane kind of game dev Facebook group, where people are like, what? These developers are from Brisbane. Who the hell are these people? So there's a lot of these kind of interesting, isolated pockets as well as the communities. So you can do that, and people and rural people, I think, primarily are working like that as well. And it's very easy to miss those people when we, like, I guess, focus on communities and scenes and industries as well, which I guess is something I still need to figure out how do you actually account for that. And they're so remote. Like I drove 3 hours to speak to someone just outside of Brisbane, which I guess is like 2 countries here. And we're just in a small town in Western Queensland. So I drove 3 hours, spoke to them for an hour, and drove 3 hours back, which was a lot of work. And like I can do Skype interviews, but I can't, then see where they work or see their local community. So there's all sorts of struggles with doing that kind of research as well, which gets really complicated. But yeah, there's more work to do there.
Cool. Let's thank Brendan again for his presentation.
Thank you.